if it comes to what postgraduate students may be approaching Deleuze for the first time, why they might do so, I really think it's a bit like reading Derrida for the first time and discovering deconstruction, in that you can never read things quite in the same way again. If we take Deleuze seriously, we're really challenged to leave behind the notion of representationalism, the idea that culture is some sort of second-order reality that just reflects what's in the real world. Culture has a material presence, and that material presence doesn't just mean things, it also does things in the world. And this is the real challenge, I think, of using Deleuze as an approach to the humanities. So, for example, for studies of literature, we normally regard literature as representing the world, as being about a reality from which it is separate. When we read poetry, that's a different case, because we accept that poetry means in other ways than just in terms of semantics, in terms of reference to a world. And a Deleuzean approach to all literature has elements of that approach to poetry, attention to its non-meaning qualities, or the way in which it means differently than just by reference. An example from my own work, I work at the moment on minority culture in Germany, and the tendency then in most of the criticism is always to interpret these writers' texts on the basis of their ethnicity as representations of a particular minority group in Germany. Whereas what I try to show is that actually they write about a whole range of other things, that their language is very powerful often, and simply not to reduce them to that already known narrative about their lives. So it's it goes back to this non-dualistic view of the world. We think about interculturalism, we think about self and other, and it's always in a dualistic paradigm. But Deleuze enables one to really to depart from that, to leave that right behind, and to encounter these writers and their texts on their own terms. So an excellent example of Deleuzean reading is Marco Abel's book Violent Affect from 2007, which is about literature and film, and indeed real life, and it focuses on violent images, and it describes and puts into practice precisely what Deleuze means by a non-representational approach to such images, in that he shows how such images, in fact, can increase our responsiveness, and indeed, as he puts it, sort of ethically, our responsibility to such violence before we interpret it, before we place it in a moral or a contextual framework, before we try to understand it. And he describes that deferral of interpretation and the importance of the moment of response really very clearly and very effectively. One of the things I want to do in the session on Deleuze in research training is to start actually with their book, with Deleuze and Guattari's book on Kafka, where they have a disarmingly simple definition of what they call minor literature. And minor literature has often been misunderstood as meaning writing which represents a minority community. And so this book is often used, and this definition is often used in ways which don't do justice to the complexity and the radical nature, really, of Deleuze's thinking. So I want to work with the students on thinking about minor literature not as a kind of literature, but as a kind of reading, as a way of approaching text, and one that doesn't just look for meaning within precept, informed by presuppositions about authors, and particularly authors from minority backgrounds tend to be expected to represent a particular ethnic identity. And this isn't what Deleuze was talking about at all. Indeed, he wants us to look beyond that. He wants us to look at writing in its own terms and without necessarily just pigeonholing it and categorizing it in this way. I think the best tip is not to be daunted by difficulty, because it's not immediately obvious what Deleuze means, and one does have to read quite a bit of him to follow his the development of his concepts, and to realise also that often he's using different words for the same thing. But with a little bit of framing and a little bit of explanation of some of the basics of his non-dualist and non-representational view of reality, I think a lot of his writing becomes just an awful lot more clear. So it's, as with anything that's worth doing, it can be difficult, but I think the rewards are very great if you persevere with it.